As they used to At this time, I'm going to invite María Bullón-Fernández to the stage to introduce tonight's program. She is a professor of English at Seattle University who specializes in medieval English literature. Her scholarship and publications center, among other topics, on gender and sexuality in medieval literature. She currently serves as Associate Dean for Arts and Humanities in the College of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming María Bullón-Fernández. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Turns out that James was my student in 2006. So it's staying in Seattle for many years makes it a joy to run into students all the time. So it's wonderful that to have seen James again. So good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you both in person and virtually. As James said, my name is María Bullón-Fernández, and I'm a professor of English and Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities at Seattle University. I'm also a member of the Board of Trustees at Humanities Washington, the organization sponsoring this event. I became a member this past January, and it has been a wonderful experience. I highly recommend it. So I want first to welcome you on behalf of Humanities Washington. The mission of HUMWA, as we affectionately call it, is to open minds and bridge divides by creating places to explore different perspectives. We host hundreds of events all around Washington State. You can check out humanities.org to find one near you. And this is one of those events, so let me take the opportunity to ask that you consider making a donation in order to help to keep events like this one as affordable as possible. Before I introduce our speaker, Nicola Griffith, and I know we're all really looking forward to her talk, let me give you an outline of our evening. So after I introduce her, Griffith will give a talk for about 40 minutes. Then she and I will have a Q&A for about 15 minutes. And after that, she will take questions from the audience, including from those of you who are online. So we ask that you use the QR code that you saw before to send your questions at any point during the talk. After we take questions at about 9 p.m., then Griffith will sign books and personalize them too. And if you don't have copies with you, you can purchase them from Charlie's Queer Books in the lobby after the event. So now let me talk in my role as a medievalist and turn to our speaker today. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce Nicola Griffith this evening. Griffith has published 9 novels, which have won numerous awards, including a Los Angeles Times Book Prize, a Society of Authors ADCI Literary Prize, 2 Washington State Book Awards, the Premio Italia, and 6 Lambda Literary Awards, among others. Her novels range from future fiction to contemporary fiction to novels of suspense. But the 3 we will talk about tonight are set in 6th and 7th century early medieval Britain. They are Hild from 2013, its sequel, Menewood, from 2023, and the Arthurian story, Spear, from 2022. In addition to writing novels, Griffith earned a PhD in 2017 from Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge with a thesis titled Norming the Other, Narrative Empathy via Focalized Heterotopia. She's also known for uncovering bias in the literary world and showing in 2015 through data-driven work that stories about women did not win the most prestigious literary prizes. Griffith began using a wheelchair in 2016, and in that year founded, and with Alice Wong co-hosted, #CryptLit, a series of Twitter chats for writers with disabilities. And from a more personal point of view, Griffith is originally from Leeds in Yorkshire, England, and she's married to writer Kelley Eskridge, and we are lucky that she lives in Seattle, so she's close to us. It is, of course, no coincidence that we're having this event during Pride Month. Happy Pride. Woo! The 3 novels set in the early Middle Ages that are the focus of Griffith's talk include queer characters in a medieval setting. And these novels are remarkable not just because they do so, but because these characters are allowed to live and act as full human beings, making good or not so good choices, establishing relationships, working, fighting, etc., without their lives being overdetermined by their sexuality. They are also remarkable because of Griffith's narrative skills and writing style. A recent New York Times review of Menewood puts it well. So writing first about the first novel in the sequel, Hild, the reviewer notes that Hild, quote, is a masterpiece of immersion, building its 7th century setting stitch by stitch through Griffith's close scrutiny of work and weather, language and literature, women and war. Then turning to its sequel, Menewood, the reviewer adds that it is everything Hild was in terms of prose craft, depth of research, and immensity of feeling, end of quote. In her works, Griffith immerses us indeed in the medieval world, but it's important to note that the period she focuses on is a specific one within what we know as the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages covers a vast span of time, about 1,000 years, so traditionally from 500 to 1500 AD. A lot happened, as you can imagine, in those 1,000 years. And to give you a sense of it, imagine for a moment that we consider our own 21st century as the end of a period in history that had one name. This would mean that the beginning of this period in history we are in would be the 11th century. Has something changed since then? Have things changed since then? So that's the Middle Ages. Griffith's primary interest is in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, and more specifically in the 7th century. This is not the Middle Ages of Magna Carta, which you may have heard about, of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's not the Middle Ages of courtly kings and queens who ruled over incipient but recognizable nation-states, such as England or Scotland. It is not the Middle Ages of thriving cities, of universities. It is not that. It is perhaps arguably a messier Middle Ages, a time when life and politics were less codified, more fluid, when there were kings and queens, but the monarchy was not an institution with a well-honed organization or with the bureaucratic structures that we now associate with it. Christianity was not institutionalized yet either at that time. Some Christian missionaries had arrived in the south of what is now England at the end of the 6th century, but the process of conversion of kings, queens, and the general population was in many ways just getting started. Griffith's work is part of a long tradition of creators and artists who, for many different reasons, have been inspired by the Middle Ages, and who, through their work, reimagined that time. And this includes, of course, countless films, some of which I'm sure you're aware of, from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, to Excalibur, or more recently, Disney's Brave, or the irreverent film A Knight's Tale. Yay! We will rock you, for those of you who know that. In Griffith's case, this reimagining aims to make visible those who have been misrepresented or erased from the records. For indeed, we often need to remind ourselves that there is a great deal about the past that is not visible or just partially visible. And this, of course, has to do mostly with who got to record what happened, who commissioned, for instance, works of art, who wrote the laws, what was deemed worth saving, and by whom. The evidence we have is thus very limited. Authors like Griffith can help us imagine what has been erased, what might be between the lines. This is very important work. Whether we like it or not, the past, and I don't just mean the Middle Ages, other periods too, is with us, and is often used in ways that authorize and shape our present and our future, ways that establish what is deemed acceptable or not, who is seen to belong. Writing about her process of composing her Arthurian novel, Spear, Griffith writes that for her story to be historically accurate, it could, quote, "It could not be a story of only straight, white, non-disabled men. Cribs, queers, women and other genders, and people of color are an integral part of the history of Britain. We're embedded at every level of society, present during every change, and part of every problem and its solution. We're here now, we were there then, so we are in this story," end of quote. As Griffith does through her writings, if we want a more inclusive present and future, we all need to explore, seek to understand, and shape ongoing conversations about the past by bringing to it inclusive perspectives. Griffith's work does this. It strives to make visible what earlier structures and powers have made invisible in order to bring about a more inclusive and just present and future. So please join me in welcoming Nicola Griffith.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Humanities Washington and Town Hall, for having me, and thank you, all you, for being here tonight. I love talking about this stuff. I'm a novelist. I tell stories for a living. And part of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is the fact that I think this is what historians do too. They tell stories for a living, only with footnotes. We grow up thinking that history is what actually happened, that it's fact, wholly true, solid, and immutable. But history is just the story we tell ourselves to make sense of what we know or what we think we know of the past, the evidence of old documents and bones and ruins. And what makes sense to each of us depends on our own understanding of the world, our experience, beliefs, and cultural biases. The story depends on the storyteller. This is really important because it's stories, written and spoken, that create culture. And culture is the shared story of who we are. The best stories are These empathy connectors, they show us and teach us about each other. And as we absorb these stories, we unconsciously absorb the values and biases embedded in those stories. I grew up in the north of England. We didn't have books in the house, but I was a very heavy library user. From the age of 7 or so, I read at least a book a day, every day. So by the time I was about age 12 and entering puberty, I'd read thousands of books. And as I entered puberty and started having these weird feelings, I began to understand that I wasn't like other girls. I felt the same way about girls that most girls felt about boys. But in all those thousands of books I had read, there wasn't a single story about girls like me. Not in stories of the past or the here and now or even in the future. Did that mean that I didn't exist? Well, obviously not. So I understood from a really early age that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It just means it's not written down, that no story tells the whole story. So now when I write my own stories, that's always front and center for me. Who or what is missing? And also, every time I write a book, readers want to know, where did you get the idea? Why did you want to write it? They want an origin story. But what I think they're really asking the writer is, who are you? They want to know where we come from, how we think, because they want to know if they should let that perspective pass their defenses. They understand that a well-written novel can change how you feel and the way you see the world. Lowering your barriers to a good book is a risk. So I'm going to tell you the origin story of Hild and of Menewood, my historical novel set in the 7th century, so you can decide whether or not to let them in and take that risk. In my early 20s, I was living in Hull, a city in the north of England. And one spring, I hiked north up the coast to a town called Whitby. Now, I don't know if you've read it, but I've read Dracula, I've read Possession. So I was expecting those 199 steps up that steep cliff. I was expecting the great ruin of the abbey against the skyline at the top of that great big cliff. But what I hadn't expected was what happened next. Has anyone here fallen in love at first sight? I have, and it happens just like that. Between one breath and the next, your whole world has changed. And something very like that happened to me at Whitby. When I crossed the Abbey threshold, it felt as though history came fisting up through the turf and through me. And it turned me inside out like a sock. I realized that history, it sounds silly, but I realized that history was made by real people. People with their own dreams and disappointments and dailiness. Those stone pillars lying tumbled around on the grass, they'd been cut by real people. People just like you or me. People who laugh and eat and shiver and change their minds and lose their tempers and wish maybe it wouldn't rain today. People who have no clue that the thing they do in a moment of boredom or fear or curiosity will set in motion history-making events. That realization really rocked me. Actually, I think it's probably one of those things that nudged me onto the writing path. But the immediate result was that I fell stone in love with that abbey and with Whitby itself. And after that, I went back to Whitby every year. I walked the coastline, I roamed the moors. I spent hours at the Abbey trying to imagine how it might have been. The tourist pamphlet I picked up explained that the abbey had been founded nearly 1,400 years ago by a woman called Hild. To find out more, I went to the library. And let me explain at this point that I didn't even have an undergraduate degree. I had no scholarly or research experience whatsoever. So I just went to the local branch of the city library. And there wasn't a single book about Hild. There was not only no big, fat, musty textbook, there was no popular bio. There was no bodice-ripping romance. There was nothing. There wasn't even a kid's book. The only reason we even know Hild existed was that in the 8th century, a monk called Bede mentioned her briefly in his ecclesiastical history of the English people. So, and this was my very first step on a very long road to getting a PhD, I went and found a copy of the ecclesiastical history and I read it. Well, that is, I read an English translation of the Latin original. Bede was a careful historian, and he was a monk. He was steeped in Roman Christian values and writing with a very particular agenda. So he shaved and shaped his facts to fit that agenda, and anything he couldn't make fit, he just left out. But he's what we've got. So what he tells us is that Hild was born in the year 614, probably in Elmet, which is now what's called West Yorkshire, but was then part of the pre-Christian Early English, or Anglish, as I'm going to call it here tonight, Anglish kingdom of Northumbria, where her father, Hereric, was poisoned when she was 3. Then we don't hear about her until she was 13, so it's a 10-year gap. And she reappears with her uncle, the king, being baptized in York. And they were some of the first Anglish to convert to Christianity. And then between age 13 and 33, there's another 20-year gap in which we know only that she was, quote, living in most noble conversation in secular habit. We don't know where, or with who, or doing what. Then at 33, she's recruited into the church and spends the rest of her life as an abbess, dying at age 66. Sorry, spoiler alert, she dies. Dies age 66 as abbess of Whitby. And during her time as abbess, Bede tells us her wisdom was so great that not only ordinary people, but even kings and princes asked for, and this was the part that made me sit up and take notice, asked for and took her advice. That's astonishing. There's a reason the 6th and early 7th century used to be called the Dark Ages. We have no written history. Hild grew up in an oral culture, a heroic age of sword and song when might was right and kings were petty warlords who took and held power by violence. Yet these brutal warlords thought Hild understood their world enough for her advice to be valuable. Also, according to Bede, she hosted the history-changing Synod of Whitby, trained 5 bishops, and midwived English literature. Cadman's hymn, the very earliest piece of Old English literature in existence, was composed at Whitby under her direction. So Hild must have been extraordinary. Bede's ecclesiastical history is the foundation of English history. Everything we think we know of Anglo-Saxon England in the early Middle Ages, all our assumptions are based on that one work. And in it, women barely exist. Those that do are described only in relation to men or God, as virgins, martyrs, wives, and mothers. Those bead-based assumptions form the backbone, part of the master story, if you like, of our history. That women don't matter. That women of even elite status, the lucky ones like Hild, have no existence, have no possibility of existence beyond marriage to a man and the continuance of the male line. So there I was at the Abbey, and I was confused. Because if women didn't matter, how come this magnificent abbey, founded by a woman, occupied such a stunning and physically impressive site? If women didn't matter, how come these murderous kings and princes sought Hild's advice and took it? And if women didn't matter, how come it was Hild's foundation that hosted one of the most momentous meetings of the 7th century? And nobody could tell me. I'm a writer. One of the reasons I write is to find out. So, in one sense, you would think this would be the perfect story for me to tell, because writing the story might answer some of these questions. Plus, honestly, I love to write about nature. And I was born and raised in Yorkshire, in Elmet, where Hild most probably lived. Perhaps I threw sticks in the same rivers. I climbed the same kinds of trees. I lay on my back on the same hillsides and looked at the same stars and wondered what they were and who made them. Basically, I longed to travel back to the 7th century and see how it smelled and sounded in Hild's time. In other ways, though, I really did not want to tell her story. I like to write about women with agency. I like to write about queer women, women doing rather than being done to. So I turned to other projects. Basically, I wrote books in which women could be queer, and years passed. But I couldn't let go of Hild. I kept coming back to her, to Whitby, to this era so full of unknowns. For the first time since I was 12, when I figured out that nobody was telling my story in history, so for this time since I was 12, I started reading history again, and I learned that Hild's time was one of massive cultural change. She was born into an illiterate tribal society, and a mere 66 years later died as part of a Christian proto-state with nascent bureaucratic apparatus. And if we believe Bede, Hild didn't just witness, but she drove some of this change. So how on earth did she do it? So I kept reading. I read everything I could lay my hands on about the late 6th and early 7th century: ethnography, archaeology, numismatics, jewelry, languages, food, textile production, flora and fauna, weapons and warfare, medical approaches, religious belief, even the weather. And then I began to read the kinds of analyses of the original sources only made possible by decades of feminist and gender scholarship. And as I read, I could feel the ground shifting just slightly, and the master story becoming just a little less monolithic. Encouraged, I went back to Bede, and this time I read very carefully. I read between the lines, and I read 3 different translations. And when I say different, I mean the difference drove me crazy, because they were so different. In fact, it drove me so crazy that in the end I just put all those aside, gathered all the passages about Hild, and translated the Latin myself. And I found a clue. I found a clue in his word choice regarding women. The few women Bede bothers to name are admired for being holy virgins or consecrated virgins, or even in the case, and this is one queen who was married for 12 years, not just to one king, but to two different kings, who preserved the glory of perpetual virginity. Hild is a glaring exception. For 20 years of her adulthood, we have no idea where she was or what she was doing to gain this reputation as someone for hard men to consult in a pinch. She wasn't married to a king. She didn't bear any sons who became kings. She wasn't a martyr or a virgin. So why didn't he just leave her out? It's clear that she must have been too well known and too important. I mean, we're talking 50 years after her death. She must have been too well known still then and too important for him to leave her out. But it's also equally clear that he didn't approve of what she did to earn her reputation, or how she did it, or perhaps more to the point tonight, who she did it with. And this wasn't much to go on, but it felt like another crack in the wall between what I knew viscerally to be true and what I'd been told was true. And just another reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I'm a queer woman with power and agency, and I was absolutely sure there would have been queer women with power and agency in the 7th century. How could there not be? Women are human. Our sensory apparatus, our brain architecture, our thought processes, our hopes, fears, desires would have been the same 1400 years ago as they are now. If people like me exist today, we would have existed then. So trust me when I say I looked hard for evidence of queer women in the early medieval. And I found nothing. I did find one anonymous letter between two nuns from the 12th century, which to me reads like a love letter, but it was, at best, subtext, not what a serious historian might consider proof. Later, actually, as my scholarship and academic access improved, I did find some other stuff, and we can get to that later, perhaps. But at the time, trying to bridge that gap between what I knew and what I'd been told was driving me to distraction. I had to find out how Hild was able to do what she did, and I needed to know how it might have been possible for her to be queer. So I decided that the only thing to do was to ignore history. I just threw out the story created to make sense of the evidence and looked at the evidence itself. I would use only the material culture, the physical objects. From those, I would build the 7th century from scratch and then put Hild in it and watch and see what happened. Basically, run a kind of controlled experiment, test possibilities. So I gathered a big pile of archaeology reports and went through them, and I tossed out all the conclusions and the discussions and just read list after list of grave goods. Things, I reasoned, couldn't lie. So now I had this picture of the thingness of the 7th century, but I wasn't sure how to begin. Because I assumed that very few of my readers would have any clue about the differences between the cultures of today and 1400 years ago. But I didn't want to do a whole bunch of tedious info dump, that whole, as you know, Bob, life a long time ago was quite different in these various ways. So, I didn't know what to do, and I dithered. And then I dithered some more. And then one day, It was the night before my birthday, and I just could not stand the thought of beginning another year having not figured this out. Also, there had been a lot of wine. And I thought, well, insert expletives. I had a few more beers. I just opened the document and began. So I'm going to read you what fell out when I just began. This is the first paragraph of Hild. The child's world changed late one afternoon, though she didn't know it. She lay at the edge of the hazel coppice, one cheek pressed to the moss that smelt of worm cast and the last of the sun, listening to the wind in the elms rushing away from the day, to the jackdaws changing their calls from outward, outward, to home now, home, to the rustle of the last frightened shrews scuttling under layers of leaf fall before the owls began their hunt. From far away came the indignant honking of geese as the goose girl herded them back inside the wattle fence, and the child knew, in the wordless way that 3-year-olds reckon time, that soon Onan would come and find her and Cian and hurry them back. Onan, some leftwise cousin of Ceredig king, always hurried, but the child, Hild, did not. She liked the rhythm of her days, time alone, Cian didn't count, and time by the fire, listening to the murmur of British and English and even Irish. She liked time at the edges of things, the edge of the crowd, the edge of the pool, the edge of the wood, where all must pass, but none quite belonged. So I sat back, I read that, and I thought, of course, what better way to begin than with a child? So we can learn alongside her, we can encounter the world as she does gradually through physical, lived experience. And you probably noticed that this opening uses a lot of physical senses, so scent, sound, texture, temperature. And there's a really good reason for that. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the concept of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are human brain cells activated both when we perform actions and then when we see others perform those actions. So when I pick up this water, neurons in the left parietal lobe fire in my brain. If I hooked you up to a functional MRI while you watched me doing this, the exact same set of neurons would fire in your brain. In other words, your brain recreates an observed experience as if you were experiencing it directly. It becomes yours. It becomes so much yours that you can run a simulation and extrapolate from it. So if you see me do this, you have a clue what I'm going to do. You can guess what happens next. Just as if I do this, some of you, especially in the front row, might duck. It's because you figured out, you run the simulation, you understand it, you feel it, it's yours. You have lived it. And the really interesting thing is that mirror neurons are triggered not just by observing an action in real life, but also by reading about it. But because you, as a reader, can't experience a written character the way you can experiencing me here tonight in person, I have to put you there as a writer. I have to use sensory detail, and the more specific, the better. Rather than a general term like cup, I have to use something much more particular. And this is where reading those endless lists of grave goods really came in handy. Because I learned that, like at Sutton Hoo, the king is buried with a turned maple cup with a thin silver rim. And so you would know that if Hild was drinking with the king, she might use that kind of cup and it would feel cold against her lip, and you could put that detail in there. Whereas if she was just in the hut of some churl, she'd probably be sharing a big, heavy, rough-hewn elm bowl. Triggering a reader's mirror neurons so that they feel what a character is feeling is called creating narrative empathy. And through narrative empathy, the reader shares a character's direct experience, even when the reader is, say, a straight 50-year-old man and the character is a bisexual teenage girl. And if you can do that, you can actually change a reader's standpoint. You can change their understanding of and attitude to the world just for a little while. Just for a little while, you can make the other seem perfectly natural. So using narrative empathy is how, with Hild, I write queer people of all genders back into the early medieval. I immerse the reader in Hild's environment so that they live Hild's experience. So, for example, when Hild enters puberty and starts to have these weird feelings, as she first begins to experience desire, the reader feels them too. And more to the point, they feel them when she does. When she's looking at a certain person, they feel it too. And it feels like their own feelings. It feels perfectly natural to them. And they learn with Hild her culture's attitudes towards sex and sexuality. And my reasoning while writing this was that without the influence of Christian notions of women's sexuality and sex as a sin, no one would much care if women had sex with each other. After all, there could be no children, and so no influence on lines of succession. I also reasoned that people wouldn't base identities on who they did or did not have sex with, that it wouldn't be that much of a cultural differentiator. And actually, as I got towards the end of the book, so I'd already done all this thinking and all this work, I stumbled across an old Irish tale of Niall Frossock, High King of Tara, in about the mid-8th century. So just right around the time Bede was writing his ecclesiastical history. And that tale reads in part. A woman came to the king carrying her boy child and put him into the king's arms. "For your kingship and your sovereignty," said she, "find out for me through your ruler's truth who the carnal father of the boy is, for I do not know myself, for I swear by your ruler's truth that I have not known guilt with a man for many years now." The king was silent. Then, "Have you had playful mating with another woman?" "I have." "This, then, is true," said the king. That woman had mated with a man just before. And the semen which he left with her, she put into your womb in the tumbling, so that it was begotten in your womb. That man is the father of your child. Let it be found out who he is. So, the phrase playful mating with another woman is not exactly judgmental. It all sounds very jolly and uncomplicated, Just a casual tumble and grins all around and nothing to worry about until there's a child involved, especially a boy child, and then it matters. So I was near the end of the book at this point, and I felt vindicated. I went full steam ahead. And a few weeks later, I wrote the last scene. I wrote the end, and I felt triumphant. I thought, No one who reads this book will ever believe that a woman couldn't be queer in the early medieval. I felt triumphant as I drank my celebratory wine that night. I felt triumphant as I fell asleep. It wasn't until the next morning when I settled down to read the first draft of this super awesome piece of amazingness that I realized my beautifully constructed destroyer of medieval assumptions was 100% shiny white. I'm white. I grew up in a racist world, and I absorbed all that prejudice. And in my early 20s, I spent years doing a lot of anti-racist work. I took a really hard look at myself and my biases. So although I've written 9 novels, this was the first and the only time I'd ever written all white characters. I had focused so hard on deconstructing assumptions about early medieval gender and sexuality that I just hadn't had room. I hadn't even thought to try identify all the other assumptions I'd been fed, along with all that medieval stuff on TV and book and film. Luckily, I realized my mistake well in time to correct that before publication. Sadly, I was too late to do anything about my other giant assumption and bias about all things early medieval. In fact, it wasn't until 2015, 2 years after Hild was published, that I realized of the 200 named characters in the book, not a single one is disabled. 2015 was when I was beginning to really claim my identity as a Crip, and I started to think about all the ableism, which is just another piece of the master story, really, that I'd been fed every day, in every sphere, obviously, including the medieval. So I don't think the timing of that realization was a coincidence. And that is the problem with implicit bias. We don't recognize it. That's what gives it such terrible power. So with the sequel to Hild, Menewood, I fixed the disability gap. Hild and Menewood are now part of a continuing story counterbalancing the master story that there were no women with agency, no queer folk, no people of color, or disabled people in the early Middle Ages. And I like to think I've done it without drawing attention to it, except in talks like this tonight. Because being a woman is not what any of my books is about. The plot never revolves around being queer. No one ever suffers or is marginalized for being queer or black or disabled. If we suffer, it's because of choices we've made, things we've done or not done, not for being who we are. In my novels, we're just ordinary folk living in the past. Which is, great. But what if we want more? What if we don't want to be ordinary? Which is, it brings me to the third book I want to talk about tonight, Spear. Spear is a short novel set in 6th century Wales about a nameless girl raised by her mother in the wilderness. It's historically accurate in all details, except for the fact that King Arthur existed and magic walks the earth. I've actually always loved the matter of Britain, the stories of Arthur and Camelot, especially found in novels like those by Rosemary Sutcliffe and Henry Treece and Mary Stuart, the kind of novels that assume the historicity of Arthur after the fall of Rome. I was never really a fan of Chrétien or Malory or any of the later romances of the medieval. So the next bit I'm going to be talking about, I'm just focusing on these kind of Dark Age novels. And what I loved about those novels was the landscape of long ago, the sense that the hero had only to step off the road to leave the safety of civilization and enter a dark, tangled wood where anything might happen. What I didn't love was never seeing people like me moving through that landscape. There were never any Crips or queer people, no real women, just women-shaped tropes, and zero people of color. Basically the same problem I dealt with Hild and Menewood. So although I loved Arthurian tales, I was never tempted to write one. Actually, I thought it was impossible to write people like me into it while still making it feel mythical and magical, to still have that exhilarating, heroic feel of legend. And there's a reason for that. The Matter of Britain is a national origin story. It's a story literally designed to explain why straight, white, heroic, manly Anglo-Saxons are the natural rulers of the world. That supremacist manifest destiny is baked in. But then one day out of the blue, and that's a whole other long story, one day out of the blue I worked out how to crack open that shell through the main character of Peretir. For one, the origins of her name made it possible to bring Welsh history and Irish myth into a largely English legend, basically to expand the center just a little. But mainly, too, it's about how Peretir, and in those later romances you probably are more familiar with the name Sir Percival, how Peretir is brought up. She's born in a cave and raised nameless and alone by her mother. She grows up tall and strong, but wholly naive. And by that, I mean unaware of and untrammeled by social rules and customs. She doesn't even know there's a gender binary. I mean, she's raised in nature just by her mother. Actually, nature raises her more than her mother. The air and water, trees and birds, they literally speak to her. So Peretir grows up poor, queer, and genderqueer, all while being utterly free to be herself, strong, confident, with no sense of inferiority. When she leaves the cave and enters the world with only the broken sword she's found and a bony horse she's befriended along the way, who teaches her to ride, she doesn't know a soul. She's often mistaken for a man, but she doesn't bother to correct anyone because she really doesn't see what difference it makes. Until, one day it really does. So I'm going to read you the scene of that day when it really does. And it's not long after she's left the cave and she's come to her first village. 3 children ran past the byre shrieking, startling an old man's ass, which kicked out and in turn upset the pony pulling an overloaded cart. And between one breath and the next, people were shouting, the ass braying, and a horse shattering the air with a panicked scream. Peretir dropped Boney's reins, leapt for the ass and soothed it with a word, then hauled on the headstall of the pony, telling it to stop, stop. Was it a gangling foal to get so confused by a mere donkey? It hung its head, shamefaced, and suffered itself to be led sweetly to the side so that people could come pick up the fallen sacks. "Boy," a thick-waisted woman was pointing to him. "You, yes you, I've work for you if you want. I'm Modron," she said. "This is my byre and my inn. Come closer. What's your name?" When Peretir came close and gave her name, Modron gave her a piercing look, then shrugged. "Peretir, is it? Well, Peretir, go find Howell and tell him you're to sleep in the hayloft and eat with us, your host too." So it was that Howell came to rely on Peretir. And by the third day, Modron and her daughter Angharad and Howell and his son Rhodri would have been hard put to remember how they had managed without the stripling with the knack of calming horses, and around whom everything seemed a little better, a little easier. On the second day, when they were mucking out a stall, Rhodri took her into his confidence. He was to marry Angharad. Angharad ton velen, he said, in a voice filled with longing. Angharad of the yellow wave. He would marry her now, today, only she was not yet ready. And indeed, Angharad, a lively young thing, paid no more attention to her customers than to Howell's son, whom she treated with offhand kindness. She paid attention, too, to her mother when she must. And then she began to pay attention to Peretir. At first, it was the glance that lasted a little too long, and then standing close and resting a hand on a strong shoulder as she leaned to help Peretir add hay to the net in the stall. Then the long, searching look, the uncertainty, the hitch in her breath that touched Peretir's cheek and told her of Angharad's longing to reach out, to touch, to taste her throat, and in turn tip back her head and let her own throat be kissed. And Peretir, drawn like a horse to water, one day shifted a little closer and let Angharad take her hand and turn it over and stroke it again like a cat, until Peretir felt herself rising to the touch, and Angharad slid her arm around Peretir's waist and whispered, "Kiss me." Her lips were soft and plump as rain, and Peretir wanted to plunge her hands deep into her golden yellow hair, deep under her skirts to the soft places beneath, and she could feel their hearts thundering like horses yoked and racing together, pulling towards the same goal. Angharad pulled back, breathing hard. She searched Peretir's face. "Whoever you are, Peretir, I would have you." And Peretir, not knowing what else to do or how to explain, took Angharad's hand and placed it on her own belly. Then, with a questioning look, lower. And when Angharad did not pull away, lower still, between her legs. "Oh," Angharad said. "Oh." Then, her cheeks flaming like sunset, she put both hands on Peretir's waist, looked directly at her, and said again, slowly and clearly, "I would have you now." And they climbed into the hayloft and stayed for some time. In Spear, Peretir is a queer woman who grew up with no social connections or advantage. But when she leaves home, her stance to the world isn't wary and folded in. It's wide open and full-throated. There's danger, of course, and loss and fear. But this isn't a story of stress or angst. It's a story of love and lust and joy. Peretir lives large because Peretir's a hero. Adrienne Rich said, "We must use what we have to invent what we desire." And I desire a world where we are all, regardless of our identities, regarded by one another as human beings. By imagining Hild as possible, I'm recasting what today we think might have been possible. By reclaiming the past, retelling it to include us all, I'm remaking the story of the present, and I hope changing the future. And by writing about Peretir, I'm reclaiming more than just reality. I'm retaking queer joy. I wrote this book. I wrote all these books for people like me, and perhaps you, who want to be immersed in a time and place we've never seen, a heroic past we've been told doesn't belong to us. Spear and Hild and Menewood are for us, for readers who long not only to finally see ourselves in that heroic past, to not just survive, but to live large, to thrive, to actually be the heroes. In my version of history, none of us are missing. Thank you. Woo, okay.
Are you okay?
Let me try that again.
There.
Okay.
Okay.
Super cool.
Thank you, Nicola, for such an inspiring talk. Thank you. Clearly, the audience has really enjoyed it. Thank you. I'd like to remind everyone that you can send your questions by connecting to the QR code. So if you want to lift your phone and try to connect there, you can send us questions. So, and I'd like to get started right away. We want to make sure we have time for conversation. So I'll start with a few questions from myself, and then we'll turn to your questions. So I'd love to start by talking about a point that you make in your talk about the sensory and physicality. And those of you who have read Nicola's work know that the senses and the environment are really crucial to the development of the novels. So I'm wondering if your narrative strategy around incorporating the senses says something about the construction of the self and about identity. Or to put it differently, how would you describe your understanding of the relationship between self and environment? Why are the senses so important to your work? And does this have anything to do with queer desires?
I'll start with the first bit.
Okay, all right.
I personally think the self, the character, the consciousness, if you like, is made in the interface between the world and the body. I think it's like traction comes from where the rubber literally meets the road. It's not the tire, it's not the road. The traction is where it meets. And I think character, personality, who we are, consciousness, comes from that interface with our environment. So, yeah, I don't think my characters could exist without their outside world. And then also thinking about how that relates to same-sex desire. Desire is very much a thing of the body. So, and the body is very much the environment. And then also for me, it's particularly important. There is so much rhetoric out there about queer desire being unnatural. So what better way to refute it than to put queer people in nature and watch them being in tune with and enfolded by nature? Mm-hmm. I hope that answers the question.
It does. It
cool.
does. And it connects to another question that I wanted to ask you. So it's interesting, as you have mentioned in your talk, that in Hild and Menewood and Spear, queer characters act normal, so to speak, right? And nobody has any negative or positive reactions. neither negative nor positive when they find out that they act on queer desires. The queer community has had some vigorous debates about whether to normalize the queer or whether the queer should be challenging the normal. So should the queer be mainstreamed or should the queer challenge the mainstream? So would you agree with those who might say that normalizing the queer might become counterproductive to the queer struggle? And is normalizing, quote unquote, ultimately what you're after? Or should we use a different word?
Do I agree that it's counterproductive to the queer struggle? No. And I had to resist adding a word in front of that. Mm-hmm. Insert expletive, no. Very no. What is the queer struggle? I mean, to me, the point of life is life, to live your best life. I don't think queer people are born to do anything in particular. We're born to live our best lives. And remind me what we're talking about again. I'm sorry, I just got... It's resisting using certain words. It kind of takes up all my cognitive energy.
But by normalizing, are you mainstreaming and making the queer heterosexual in a sense, right? Because it's all the same.
No.
Okay.
I'm not normalizing as in unifying and making everybody the same. I'm naturalizing. So it comes back to that putting people in nature, like being seen as just people. Mm-hmm. So actually, I mean, it's not like I write utopias. I mean, my characters suffer plenty. They also have lots of joy, but it's not because they're queer. Mm-hmm. It's because of things they do or don't do. Not because of, as I said earlier, not because of who they are.
Yeah. Okay. Sort of related to this too, and you and I had a conversation about this. There's a scholar, Jonathan Shee, who recently has written about how when medievalists feel defensive about the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages has been taken over by many ideologies, but recently by white supremacists to justify including terrorist acts. So medievalists feel defensive, and so they maybe overcompensate and try to portray a Middle Ages that was not racist, that was not xenophobic, that was not homophobic. If in your novels there's no homophobia, are we idealizing the Middle Ages? Is there a danger in not recognizing that? And you and I have talked about how there was plenty of homophobia, right? And interesting examples of that. So.
No, again, very no. I do not think that what I'm doing is romanticizing the Middle Ages or excusing the Middle Ages in any way. My point is that we know very little about the Middle Ages. And earlier I was alluding to that, some things that I actually found. And they were the penitentials of Theodore, who was Archbishop of Canterbury during the last decade of Hild's life, and also the penitentials of Bede, so he was writing about 50 years after Hild's death, so roughly contemporary. And penitentials, if you don't know, are basically lists of sins and their prescribed punishments. Or penances. And in those days, these penances were often food-based. So it wasn't like you were being whipped around a post or hung, drawn, and quartered or anything. You just had to eat bread and water, or you couldn't have mead on Sundays or something like that. So you get a penance for a set amount of time. And the penitential of Theodore, I can't remember the exact words, but I think it says... a woman practicing vice with another woman, 3 years penance. However, a man having sex with a married woman, 4 years penance. Anyone lying under oath, 4 years. So you tell me, like, how hard was it to be a dyke back in the day? You know, it was worse if you lied. I mean, so you tell me how bad it was. So how much am I exaggerating? And then Bede, now this bit's interesting, actually. Bede, he talks about women fornicating with women. And again, 3 years, women fornicating with women, unless you're a nun, and unless you're having sex with another nun using an instrument, then it's 7 years for you. But you see, I think that's less about being queer than about usurpation of male power. So again, you know, what do we actually know about this period? So yeah, I have an issue with that.
Yeah, I mean, because what we know is that law codes, we know the penitentials, we don't know from people actually having those experiences.
Exactly,
as
because
said.
if you think about
and that's the gap you're trying to fill,
yeah,
right?
if you think about all that we know so little about so few people in this era. There's so few written records. So we know it's about kings and princes and some queens, but we don't know about any ordinary people. And if we know about ordinary people, and I'm talking now the last 2,000 years, generally speaking, the only time we know about ordinary people is when they break the law. And then you have to look at who's been making the law, and how it's all bound up in protecting power and how morals become civil codes and on and on and on. There must have been lots of relatively happy queer people, relatively well accepted by their community.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which also goes back to why you're interested in the early Middle Ages, right? Which is, because as I was saying, it's a messier Middle Ages, and as you're saying, there's much less codified at the time. Power was not as structured, and you didn't have central powers with delegates who could impose that power in the same way that you have it in the second half of the Middle Ages. Right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're interested in that. Because, I mean, in the second half of the Middle Ages, there are more serious consequences sometimes to being found out, especially for men.
Yes, it's true. And
including in death in some cases.
Even in Bede's time, punishment for men having sex with men was 10 years.
Yeah. But yeah. So I want to ask another question, and then I'll see if we have any questions coming in. So far, I haven't seen any, but I can keep asking questions. So if you don't have any, I can keep asking questions. But let me ask one more, and then I'll double check. So this is a question about other ways in which one can queer history or bring out the queer in history. And in your author's notes in Spear, you say that you refuse to write about the traditional individualistic hero, even as you write in the heroic and epic and romance genre. So I'm wondering if this refusal is a form of queering history and literature. Can you talk about how you construct the different kind of hero? A hero whose purpose is not to conquer or accumulate power, but to, in a way, constrain the exercise of power by any one individual?
Absolutely.
Is this a queer move as well, in a sense?
Yeah. It's such a myth, I think, in our culture that there is a lone hero. And in this sense, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has quite a bit to answer for, right? The superhero who just does what they do, and then they move on, leaving all this shattered stuff behind them, those smoking buildings, and they don't care. They're a hero. And I have never really been very keen on that idea. I love people doing really brave, cool things. And I think what really changes the world is community. That's how science gets done in groups. Artistic movements are groups. Protests are groups. Lone heroes, it's just such bullshit, frankly. I mean, sorry, yes, insert X, whatever, you know. Yeah.
Okay.
Community,
yes.
people.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That comes through very clearly in your work, and I find that very interesting. Yeah. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, you got it. Okay, Sarah to the rescue.
It's a community, you see.
That's right. It's a community effort. Okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh, what happened?
I don't know. There you go.
Starting with. Okay. Okay. How do you conceptualize differences in race, gender, and ability outside of the relatively more modern language we have been taught and used to construct these differences?
I don't really. I mean, in my certainly historical works, and that's what we're talking about tonight, so in Hild, Spear, and Menewood, I don't talk about queer people. I just talk about people living their lives, and some of them have sex with men, some have sex with women, some have sex with both, some have sex with none. And in one of my books, bit of a spoiler, I won't tell you who, there's a throuple, so that was fun. But no one really talks about it. People don't base their identities on that. And partly they don't base their identities on that because they're not oppressed for it. And quite a few identities these days come from this tension between us and them. And so if you're not divided into an us and them on lines of sexuality, then you don't need an identity for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. There's a related, very interesting question as well. Do you feel freed or challenged by writing queer characters without 21st century gender and sexuality labels and concepts? So do you feel
It's interesting. Actually, I don't... Because I've written a lot of other books that aren't set in the past. So, for example, this time next year, again for Pride, hooray, 3 of my contemporary novels there are basically novels of suspense about a woman called Aud Torvingen, who's a 6-foot-tall Norwegian woman who kills people. And she's a right old dyke. Oh my God, yeah. But I use exactly the same kind of conversation, the same descriptions. She has the same sorts of relationships that Hild does or Peretia does. So I just treat my characters, as people. But I do use a very particular narrative trick. Actually, this is what I wrote my whole PhD on, so I'm not going to go into massive detail. If you're interested in reading my PhD, you can find it on my website. You can download the PDF for free. It's called Norming the Other, and you'll find a link there, so go read that. But the narrative trick I use is basically making the main character kind of untouchable in terms of their sexuality. They are never traumatized or oppressed for being queer or a woman. So it's not a world utopia. Other people are, but they themselves are not. So there's a whole PhD about that, if you want to.
Okay, thank you. The next question, can you say more about the people of color in the Middle Ages, particularly Great Britain?
Yes, I am not the most knowledgeable about this, but there are a couple of good books, and I will try and remember, I think African Europeans or Africans in Europe, or by Odette. Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't remember the specifics. I will put it on my website later. But yes, I mean, if you think about Britain, it was, there was a lot of trade to Britain all through the Roman era. I mean, Rome was a multicultural empire. Mm-hmm. So you had Sarmatians, you had Ethiopians, you had people. I mean, just going back to Theodore, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he was Greek, and his abbot, so we're talking Hild's lifetime, and the abbot at Canterbury was North African. So there were people of colour all over Britain. They just keep gradually getting whitewashed away. I mean, just look at, I can't see the poster right now, but the poster for tonight's events. Those two male saints, Morris and Theophradus, I think, they were Egyptians. They weren't blonde-haired, blue-eyed guys. Like, Jesus wasn't blonde-haired, blue-eyed, but that's the picture of Jesus I grew up with. It just keeps getting blended out. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people of color, and race was not treated the same way a long time ago as it is today.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to mention here the work of Mary Beard on Roman England, where she has also demonstrated that there were many people of color in Rome who would have stayed in England as England moved into the Middle Ages. Yeah. So, yeah. Just a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. So, what are your favorite works of queer medievalism? And if you had the chance to teach or take a course on the queer Middle Ages, what text stories would you want to see included?
Queer medievalism. That is a complicated term. Okay. There is, honestly, my favorite fictions about medieval times, there just aren't really many queer people in those books. I mean, like I was saying earlier, it's Mary Stuart's The Crystal Cave, or Henry Treece's The Last Captains, or Rosemary Sutcliffe's Sword at Sunset. Those things are amazing books. To get queer people back then, you're talking about fantasy. So things like Lucy Holland's Sister Song, or Song of the Huntress, stuff like that. There isn't a lot.
Yeah. In terms of medieval texts, not so much medievalism, so stories about the Middle Ages, but medieval texts. I will mention, this is not necessarily queer, but it's gender bending, the Roman des Silence. So some people know it around here. Yay! It's a 13th century text, French text about a girl who is raised as a boy and becomes a knight, and is a very successful knight. And spoiler alert, he is discovered at the end, right? And it's a bit of a crazy book, but it's a really interesting book as well. So if anybody's interested, it's the Roman de Silence, or the Romance of Silence. And a fascinating critical work about the history of non-binary gender in the Middle Ages came out a couple of years ago by Leah Devun, D-E-V-U-N. It's called The Shape of Sex, from Genesis to the Renaissance. So that's a really wonderful work as well. And I'll ask the final question. Is Hild a top?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. So unfortunately, we need to wrap it up. So we have to conclude our conversation. And before we go and you have the opportunity to get your book signed by Nicola, I want to thank everyone who sent these great questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And thank you to all of you who are here in person or online. Thank you also again to Humanities Washington and Town Hall for making this event possible, and especially to Sarah Faulkner, Program Manager. She's the one who came up with this event and did all the legwork and the logistics for it. She has been an incredible partner. And of course, thank you to Nicola for your wonderful, provocative talk.
And thank you, Marie.
Thank you. So please join us in the lobby if you want to have your book signed. Thank you for coming.